for coming to this session. I'm sure a lot of you are already tired karena ini udah akhir minggu gitu, akhir weekdays. So I really appreciate your time to be here. My name is Uzlah. I am a final year international relations student in UI, and I've been focusing my studies on global environmental issues. So I'm really excited to share about this topic today. So in short, we are going to talk about the role of countries in the issue of climate change, and especially in the context of Conference of the Parties, or COP, which is actually a conference on climate change conducted by the United Nations. And next month will be the 26th session of this conference. So without further ado, I will start my presentation. All right. So for today's occasion, I will be mainly talking about three main things. The first is about the issue of climate change itself, basically introducing you to the events, what have been happening in the issue of climate change, so the timeline and also the relevant actors. And then I will also talk about the international regimes that are related to climate change. This includes UNEP, or UN Environment Program, and also UNFCCC, or UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then the third one, which is also going to be the main point of this training session, is regarding the role of countries in this issue, especially since there is a huge distinction between developed and developing countries in many issues, but also in the issue of climate change, this distinction is really apparent. So this will be the topics that we'll be talking about. But before I start the material on Climate Change 101, I want to also share with you a short, or like a small quiz. So if you could go to menti.com. I will put it on the chat box. So everyone could go to menti.com and put the code. Wait. All right. So everyone could go to this. I will be sharing my screen again. All right. So I hope that's visible. So I want you guys to go to this slide, menti.com, and put in the code 97700965, and answer the question. What comes to your mind when you hear climate change? So I will be presenting the answers. All right. So we already have urgent, disrupted environment, global warming, disaster. Okay, we're getting even more words here. Universal problem. Okay, I will wait for another 1 minute before starting the presentation. So if any of you wants to add some words, you could do it now. We have Paris Agreement here, heat wave, collective action, irreversible, next global crisis. All right, hot. Okay, so yeah, so we could see here that there are actually a lot of words that come to our mind when we hear the word climate change. So it involves a lot of like tragedies, a lot of things that might happen if climate change becomes worse. And it also is a topic that includes a lot of either subtopics, such as heat wave, sea level rise, disasters, and so on and so forth. So with that, we're just going to start the presentation again. Since I see that a lot of you are already pretty familiar with climate change, so we could actually start the presentation. So here, what exactly is climate change in a nutshell? I'm going to explain it in three main things first. The first is what is climate change? So, climate change could be explained as a long term, irreversible, someone already mentioned irreversible, and also dangerous changes in global temperature and climate patterns. So, some people say it's only global warming, meaning that the Earth is basically getting warmer, but it's actually so much more than that. It involves a lot of changes within the nature and also the cycle of our climate and our planet, and therefore these changes will become more severe and could be actually dangerous for the lives on Earth because it will cause disasters, it will cause sea level rise, it will cause sinking islands and other things that might happen to us. And it will also jeopardize us in the future. And then why is climate change actually happening? So there is there's a perception that says climate change actually happens naturally, but it also happens not naturally, meaning that our activities as humans also impact the earth and therefore cause climate change. So it has been recognized that the current climate change that we are facing right now is also caused by anthropogenic or human induced activities that produce a massive amount of carbon emissions. So, a lot of our activities, such as burning fossil fuels by using them for our transportations, and also activities such as manufacturing and industries that emit a lot of pollution, this all create a massive amount of carbon emissions. And how do carbon emissions actually impact the Earth? So these carbon emissions will trap heat in the atmosphere. And then by trapping this heat in the atmosphere, it will increase the Earth's temperature because the Earth will not let go of that heat, but instead keeping it within the reach of the planet. And then it will also disrupt the natural climate processes. So this could be said that our activities, which emit carbon emissions, will then increase the temperature of our own planet and also disrupt the climate. So by saying this, it means that climate change is actually a problem or a crisis caused by ourselves, and therefore it will need our own actions to solve it. So, after knowing what exactly is climate change, what causes it, and how does it occur, we need to also make sure to pay attention to the timeline of the major events. When did it start becoming more severe, and what has actually been done by some actors throughout the process? So, we could trace back the start of climate change. Actually, it's not the start, but more like the beginning of the climate change becoming even more urgent. So we could trace it back to the 1950s, which is known as the era of industrial revolution and also great acceleration. So the 1950s marked the fourth industrial revolution. So the world started to use more fossil fuels, started to conduct more manufacturing industries. So since it was after the World War II, and a lot of countries were starting to implement liberal economic policies, and therefore it kind of pushed private actors, such as companies, to create more and more products without considering the impact to the environment. So this also increased the population of many countries and also the consumption because liberal economy means freedom. And then it also lead many countries that we now know are as developed countries to become more industrialized, but they did that industrialization very rapidly and also more exploitatively. So some countries colonized other countries, and also they created companies or created products that did not really have good impacts to the environment. They just kept producing to achieve more capital or profit. And so this rapid acceleration of the economy further increased the amount of carbon emissions in our atmosphere. And also within the 1950s, we knew that there was like um, the London smog. So like many countries, many areas in the world that were industrializing actually faced many pollution. So moving forward to the 1970s, it could be considered as the start of recognition of environmental problems caused by carbon emissions, because in 1970s, scientists found that the ozone layer was depleting and it was caused by greenhouse gases. So this was the first time greenhouse gases or carbon emissions were seen as somewhat dangerous to the environment, and therefore many people, a lot of parts of the society started to become more aware of environmental problems. They became more concerned, and they pushed the politicians to start talking more about this problem. And so Earth Day and also the UN Conference on Human Environment were firstly held within this decade in the 1970s. But despite already increasing the awareness of the public, the issue of climate change still became even more severe and urgent. So in the next decade, in the 1980s, climate change became a major global issue, because finally scientists recognized that the increase of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions were actually caused by ourselves, by the human activities, specifically by corporations that were producing the most amount of carbon emissions. And therefore, climate change was recognized as a major global issue. And the UN um, actually established a body called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or now usually referred to as IPCC, which was established to assess the development of this issue of climate change. So they have been evaluating, analyzing, doing research on climate change. And if any of you is aware, IPCC just released a report lately. Talked it said that climate change has been so severe that we might probably not be able to do anything about it if we don't start making changes now. So fast forward to the 2010s, which is the last decade, it became the decade of climate change, meaning that natural disasters or the impacts of climate change became more frequent and more severe. And a lot of us actually happened to experience the impact of climate change already. So global concern became more influential. A lot of activisms or movements started to rise. Maybe if you heard Greta Thunberg and her movements, and also more discourses of climate change being talked about in global context and also national and domestic political context. So by knowing this timeline, we could trace who are the actors, who are the ones that have been contributing the most to the climate change, and what have we done, what has countries done in order to solve this problem. All right, so before we move to the second topic, which is international regimes, I want you guys to move to the menti.com again. We will be answering the second question. So I will be sharing my screen again. So for the second question, it will be about the international regimes. So please answer which of these terms are you familiar with? UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, COP, UNEP, Kyoto Protocol, SDGs. Just check all of this that apply to you that you are already aware of. I will type the code again and just go to the menti.com for those who haven't. So we see that here, most of you guys are already familiar with SDGs, some familiar with Paris Agreement and UNEP and Kyoto Protocol, but none of you is familiar with the UNFCCC and COP, which is interesting because the topic today is actually more about COP and UNFCCC. Okay, so half of you are aware of SDGs. Um, So I hope this gives you an image that um, the general public and also students are actually only aware of agreements and goals that have been more publicized instead of the ones that are like UNFCCC, COP. Only a few groups of the public, such as students that are actually studying about environment or IR, are aware or familiar with this, but the others are not very much familiar. So with that, it will be really interesting for you guys to learn more here. So we're gonna move back to the presentation. So there are, all right. So there are a few international regimes that are related to the topic of climate change. So first is the one that some of you are already familiar with, the UN Environment Program, or UNEP. So UNEP is actually a UN body that focused on all environmental problems, not just climate change, because environmental problems actually include a lot of topics. So the UN Environment Program was established in 1972 after the first UN Conference on Human Environment, and it was mandated to keep the global environment under review. So it conducts research, and it also gives warnings to countries regarding environmental problems before that disasters or other impacts of the environmental problems could happen. And it also gives political recommendations, policy recommendations to countries. And not just UNEP, we also have UNDP, which some of you are already familiar with SDGs. So UNDP is established in 1965, but it is actually not focused on just environment, but it focused on a lot of aspects of the development. But to provide expert advice, training and grants, and also work on solution to development challenges, it includes many aspects of development, but it also includes the aspect of environment. So UNDP is also taking collaboration and also contribution in SDGs, which a lot of you are already aware of. So SDGs do not only include environmental problems, but it has a goal specifically talking about climate action, and also other goals that are related to climate change, such as life on land, life underwater, and also energy, clean energy. And then the biggest part of climate change regime in the international world actually revolves around the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. I'm aware that some of you are not familiar with this, so I'm going to take more time to explain about this. So the UNFCCC is actually not a body or a program like UNEP and UNDP. It was actually more about a treaty. So UNFCCC is an environmental treaty that is established at the UN Conference on Development, on Environment and Development, or firstly known as Earth Summit. Wait,
Okay, we'll wait a second. I think Uzla is having some issues.
so I'm gonna continue. So UNFCCC itself is more focused on climate change. So we will be talking more about this in the um, next presentation slides. So it is actually functioning to do research and also conduct meetings and negotiations on climate change policies. And it has created several agreements in regard to climate change, such as Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, which will be explained later. And it also has been ensuring that food production is not threatened, because food production is actually part of not only climate change but also the greater environmental problems. But it is really central to the economy and also the social welfare. So it is also part of the functions of UNFCCC. But we could define UNFCCC just as this central regime that controls or discusses about climate change in the international context. So in the next slides, we'll be focusing more on UNFCCC and how it functions. What are the policies that it has established, and so on and so forth. So I will just move to the next. Wait, sorry. Um, I think there is some problem. All right. So so regarding UNFCCC, there are a few things that must be first understood because it's kind of complicated. It is a treaty, not a body, but it has a secretariat. It does meetings, so it is actually pretty weird if we learn about it or hear about it just slightly. So UNFCCC, despite it being a treaty, it has established a secretariat, and also it conducts conferences. So here we have the Conference of the Parties, or COP, which is the supreme decision-making body of the convention of the UNFCCC. So every party that has signed to the UNFCCC convention are represented at the COP, and they will convene meetings and negotiations and the annual Earth Summit or Climate Summit that will be conducted this year in the next month by I think like the late October and early November. And this COP, Conference of the Parties, will be making regulations or policy recommendations. Basically, they will negotiate the policies and the agreements that should be conducted or executed by the parties, which are countries. So they review and take decisions for the implementation of the convention and also its legal instruments. And what exactly are these legal instruments? So I think there's some error within the presentation. It's supposed to be 1992, if I'm not mistaken. So one of the results of the COP is Kyoto Protocol. It was actually kind of the first result of the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. So Kyoto Protocol is a treaty that commits industrialized countries or developed countries and economies in transition or developing countries. So we could underline that Kyoto Protocol preferred to use several terms that are not actually normally used. So instead of using developed countries, they're using industrialized countries. And instead of using developing countries, they're using economies in transition. And this could be seen as their attempt to include different characteristics of countries. But the target of Kyoto Protocol itself is to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they're trying to limit the emissions that are created by each country, but mostly focusing on industrialized countries because they are seen as the ones that emit the most carbon emissions. And economies in transition are also asked to limit their carbon emissions, but they were not the main focus on this protocol. So developed countries could be seen as the main target of actors in this in Kyoto Protocol. However, Kyoto Protocol also uses the principle called common but differentiated, or common but differentiated, which is a principle that will be assigned to each country, and they will be having some policies and also actions according to each country's target. So they will have this kind of like similar characteristics of solutions, but it should be in accordance with each country's conditions and also status and capacity. So this common but differentiated principle is also being implemented in the next agreement, which is the Paris Agreement. So the Kyoto Protocol ended in 2015, and afterwards, the Conference of the Parties convened again and created this Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is also an outcome of the Conference of the Parties, and it commits all countries, not just developed countries or developing countries, but all countries are being um, involved in this agreement, and its target is to limit the rise of global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is more focused instead of Kyoto Protocol, because Kyoto Protocol somehow targeted just the limitation of carbon emissions. Meanwhile, Paris Agreement focused on the limit of temperature rise, which is targeted at a maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because this is seen by the scientists as the biggest amount of temperature rise that we could have, because if we reach higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius, it will be really impactful to the environment, especially to the areas that are most risky if they will experience temperature rise, such as the North Pole and South Pole, which if they experience this temperature rise higher than 1.5 degrees, they will create more sea level rise and probably sink a lot of islands. And Paris Agreement also uses the common but differentiated principle, and they are translating it to the mechanism of nationally determined contributions or NDCs. So nationally determined contributions are basically a call for actions and targets and policies from each state party to be submitted to the UNFCCC, and these contributions will be in accordance with each country's capacity. So so far, Indonesia has already submitted their NDCs, the updated one, but it is seen by um, a lot of actors that the NDC of Indonesia is not really ambitious, because it is still like playing safe with their policies. They don't really want to take climate change seriously. So this is actually one of the problems about NDCs, because it is not binding. It is not legally binding, and it is not really um, forcible to countries. So each country could just create policies according to what they want to make. So those are some of the outcomes of Conference of the Parties, which is the decision-making body of the UNFCCC. So if any of you joins an MUN a in the Council of UNFCCC, you will be acting as parties within the conference of the parties. And you will be discussing about climate change issues and probably create resolutions similar to Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, where your state of capacity, your status and background, especially in regard to your economy, will be really impactful. And last but not least, regarding international regimes, is the Sustainable Development Goals. It is actually established by the UN General Assembly, but UNDP plays a big role in implementing and also overseeing the implementation of SDGs. So SDGs itself is the continuation of the previous goals, which is Millennium Development Goals, if any of you is familiar with that. So MDGs ended in 2015 and then succeeded by SDGs. And since MDGs previously only had a few goals, it was very packed. It did not really focus on a certain topic. In SDGs, they made it even more specific. So climate action became its own goal in the goal number 13, and many other goals also talked about environmental issues, but they have made this specific um, goal dedicated for solving the issue of climate action. So the UN decided with this SDGs that climate action should be able to solve the climate change issue at least by 2030. So these are the related conferences, outcomes, things about international regimes or UN things that are related to climate change. Now, after knowing the issue and also regarding the international regimes, the big question is, what exactly are the role of countries in this issue? So Previously, I've talked about the actors as well, developed and developing countries. What exactly are their roles? Is it different, or is every country undergoing the same policies, and should every country contribute the same way? So this could be explored later. But I will be focusing on three things. The first is causes. How do countries cause climate change? And then the solutions. How do countries contribute in solving climate change? And last but not least is regarding the cooperation between countries itself. So shortly, in general, all countries must at least do these three things. The first is to limit and reduce carbon emissions, especially in national context. So, in order to reduce the global carbon emissions, of course, every country has to limit their own carbon emissions within their own territory. Um, and then the second one is to establish and implement environmentally responsible policies in accordance with existing agreements and goals. So to establish these policies, of course, every country has to consider a lot of aspects. Misalnya mungkin Indonesia sendiri, kita banyak banget hal-hal yang berkaitan sama ekonomi gitu, kayak sama industri. Everything in our country um, must be considering its impact to the economy. Terus banyak banget undang-undang yang emang dibikin untuk fungsi industri gitu. So this environmental responsible policies must be created by each country, but so far the implementation and also even the making of these policies are really hard to do because every country is still kind of prioritizing industries and the economy instead of the environment. And last but not least is all countries must cooperate with other countries and also non-state actors, especially the private actors, perusahaan, investor. They are the ones that play a big role in the economy and will be impacted the most, and will be also really impactful to the environment and to the climate change issue. So these are the three things that countries must do in general. But there is a problem about general things in climate change because climate change does not occur equally. So it is not a general issue. It might happen globally, but every region faces it differently. And every region, every country also contributed differently to the cause. So as you can see here, between developed and developing countries, they even have a really different contribution in global historical emissions. So kalau misalkan negara-negara maju karena mereka udah industrialisasi dan mengalami peningkatan kegiatan-kegiatan ekonomi itu lebih dahulu dan they created a lot of emissions even since 1950s or even before. So they have this big contribution to the global emissions, even reaching almost 80%. Meanwhile, developing countries, including Indonesia, we started to industrialize only a few decades before. So sebenarnya kalau negara-negara berkembang itu nggak terlalu banyak gitu kontribusinya terhadap isu perubahan iklim. However, we faced a huge impact of the issue. We have to face natural disasters, and our small islands have to sink or experience sea level rise. But at the same time, the Western or developed countries are trying to make the global agenda to be more environmentally friendly. Jadi negara-negara maju udah mulai bikin kegiatan-kegiatan atau agenda green economy, sustainable development, because they don't have to search for economic growth anymore. They don't have to maintain their best to they don't have to try their best to maintain their economy karena mereka udah maju gitu. So they could just transition into a greener economy easier than us. However, developing countries are still struggling to even reach a great economic growth, and therefore we are somehow sacrificing the condition of the environment. So there is this gap between developed and developing countries. its impact, its causes, there are a big differences between these two groups of countries. So this should be really taken into consideration when you're joining an MUN or you're just talking about climate change in general. You have to be aware and conscious of the different capacity conditions, especially historical conditions of every country. So there's also this terminology called most affected people and areas, or MAPA. So MAPA is basically areas that were colonized or exploited by developed countries and are now historically marginalized. So developing countries, small and coastal areas, and including also indigenous people in some developed countries, we are the ones that the least responsible for the climate change, but we are the ones who suffer the most now. So this is a term that could actually be understood as global south, but since global south does not really represent the struggles and also the problem, so some activists in the world created this terminology, and you could also take into consideration this category of countries and communities when talking about the issue of climate change, because these are the ones that are expected to contribute as much as other communities and areas, such as, for example, Indonesia. Kita diharapkan untuk punya ambisi komitmen iklim yang besar gitu, tapi padahal kita tuh kan nggak terlalu banyak berkontribusi pada masa lalu. Sejak industrialisasi aja baru banyak berkontribusi ke climate change. So this should be taken into consideration, and therefore there are different roles between developed and developing countries, or between countries that have been contributing the most to climate change and those that are not actually contributing a lot but have been facing the biggest consequences. So this will be kind of the main point of this session. So every country has different condition and therefore they have different roles in climate change. But to simplify it, we could differentiate every country with the group of developed countries and the group of developing countries. So developed countries are expected to have these roles. First, contribute in financing, capacity building, and transferring technology for climate action in developing countries. So instead of just focusing on their domestic climate policies, mereka juga diharapkan bisa berkontribusi untuk membantu negara-negara yang sebelumnya dieksploitasi atau kurang bisa industrialisasi pada saat mereka udah terindustrialisasi gitu, which are developing countries. Since developing countries are not actually the ones that contribute the most to carbon emissions, but instead developed countries are the ones that have the biggest responsibility. Mereka harus bisa bantu tadi secara pendanaan atau transfer of knowledge atau technology untuk ngebantu negara-negara tersebut. And inside of their own countries, they should initiate emissions reduction activities. Apa aja sih sebenarnya yang bisa dilakukan untuk mengurangi emisi karbon ini? The first is conducting carbon projects. Carbon projects are projects that are basically focused on reducing carbon emissions. Jadi bisa dalam program penanaman, reboisasi, atau banyak kegiatan-kegiatan lain yang sebenarnya bisa dilakukan to reduce emissions. And also carbon offsetting. So carbon offsetting is basically reducing the amount of carbon emissions in other place if you can't do it in your own place. So this could be also done by developed countries if they have to create certain policies. They should also include policies that will reduce the carbon emissions in other countries, especially in developing countries. And last but not least is carbon pricing, or putting a price on carbon emissions. Ini ada dalam bentuk, mungkin sekarang kita tahu ada pajak karbon. Jadi kalau ada yang ngeluarin emisi karbon tuh harus bayar pajak, atau penjualan emisi karbon gitu. So there are a lot of ways to be done, and developed countries are expected to initiate this because they are the ones who are economically capable to do this. And then on the other side, developing countries should also execute climate action activities. but it should be conducted according to each country's capacity, because we know that they are still struggling to improve their economic growth or maintain economic stability. So they should adjust their climate activities according to their capacity. However, this is where the role of developed countries is also needed. Karena walaupun developing countries bisa bikin kebijakan atau aksi iklim yang sesuai dengan kapasitas mereka masing-masing, it doesn't mean that they could make a very not non-ambitious actions, such as Indonesia, for example. Bukan artinya kita bisa bikin climate actions yang nggak terlalu serius gitu, yang ecek-ecek lah intinya. But we should still try to make ambitious plans, but by utilizing the help of other actors, including developed countries. And then the second one, developing countries could also participate in emissions reduction activities, but they're becoming the host countries of carbon projects. Tadi misalnya kalau negara maju pengen ngurangin emisinya, they could do it also in other countries by creating carbon projects. And also, developing countries could develop carbon pricing mechanisms, although this will be kind of hard to do for a while because they have to still pay attention to their current economic conditions. But this could also be an option for some countries that are already trying to make these carbon pricing mechanisms. So that would be all for the material, actually. So the point of this issue is actually there are different roles for different countries with different backgrounds and conditions, especially in the issue of climate change. So this is also really helpful for you if you want to attend an MUN regarding climate change. You have to pay good attention to your economic conditions of the country, not just economic conditions, but also social conditions, political conditions. But the economy plays a big role in the issue of climate change. And so, whether your country is a developing country or a developed country, really impacts the position of your country. So that would be all for the material. Now, I think this will be the part where you guys will have to participate in discussions. So I have prepared a question for the discussion here. Jadi nanti teman-teman akan dibagi jadi dua kelompok ya. Um,
Yeah, sure. However, we now have 47 people here. So I think if we just divide it into two breakout rooms, it would be still too much. But should we just keep it at that? Atau menurut kamu, should we like divide it further?
yeah, maybe we could divide it into four groups. So two groups will be developed countries and two will be developing countries. Will that be okay?
Okay.
Alright. Okay, so nanti teman-teman akan dibagi. Jadi ada yang group developed countries, ada yang developing countries. And the question is simple. What solutions would you propose at the COP26? This doesn't have to be a grand solution with like branding or like explicit or like specific mechanisms, but you just have to answer these karmas just simply. Yang penting bisa ngejawab inti dari pertanyaannya gitu. So the first is, how will your countries try to achieve carbon neutrality? Maksudnya nggak mengeluarkan banyak banget emisi karbon lagi by 2050 and to keep the limit of 1.5 degrees within reach, which is the target of Paris Agreement gitu. How will your countries try to achieve this dan memastikan kalau target Paris Agreement itu bisa tercapai. Basically kayak gitu. And then the second is, how will your countries try to protect the society and natural habitats, especially in regard to climate change, karena climate change ini akan banyak berdampak ke masyarakat dan juga habitat natural. Dan yang terakhir adalah how you mobilize the funds that are needed for climate action. This is probably the one that will be really related to your countries ya, karena kayak developed countries mungkin yang akan punya the funds, and then developing countries are the ones that will receive the funds. So this will be the karmas. Untuk waktunya berapa menit? 15 ya?
I think, yeah, 15 would be enough. And by the way, guys, don't leave just yet. I know that the number of the participants are decreasing. If you're afraid, no worries. Uzla is here.
Yeah,
She
it's just
will.
gonna be like for fun. Yeah, for you guys to just learn, and there will be a lot of you in the room, so you could hear a lot of opinions as well. Berarti ini dibagi jadi dua aja ya?
Okay, I think we can settle at 2 in that regard. And also perhaps
Okay.
then Uzla, you can like go in between the breakout rooms, kind of to like give some advices and things like that. Okay, so I will assign each of you now.
Wait. So just for explanation, mungkin nanti setelah itu bisa dipresentasiin kayak 5 menit kali ya. Just maybe like on Word atau presentation slides. It's up to you guys.
Okay.
Untuk Alright, thank you. We can get into the breakout.
Okay, guys, in the main room, you can choose. But I think that you guys have been assigned to like a certain room. You guys can just enter that breakout room, and yeah.
Okay. Okay, so these are our solutions from developed countries. It isn't much, but first, we decided that developed countries should contribute in financing for climate action in developing countries. Because developing countries don't have the necessary funds, or um, they mainly don't have the necessary funds or technology to combat climate change itself. So more or less, they need help from developed countries. How? We first thought that we could follow example of Norway when the country gave $56 million to Indonesia in 2020 to if Indonesia can reduce its rates because Indonesia can reduce its rates of deforestation. Furthermore, yeah, I think this is also another example from one of our members. Canada also, as part of its 2.65 billion pledge, is investing almost more than 2 billion as loan finance to mobilize additional investments for climate action. I think this is more suitable in the given return strategy. So what is the given return strategy? It's where developed countries can be incentivized to give investments on climate-friendly projects. So it's not only developing countries that got help in combating climate change, but developed countries also have a return on investment as well. So yeah, and another solution, I think this is very creative from one of our members, is that developed countries also could reduce in, for example, their food consumption because it's the biggest factor, one of the biggest factor of carbon emission as well. It could reduce their serving size. And while it is a minor step, it can give a major step forward to climate, to reduce carbon emission. And that's it from us.
All right, thank you so much, Kopas, for presenting your solutions from the developers blog. So from your solutions, it's the first thing that I noticed is that it really aligns with the karmas that I mentioned, that I asked you guys to answer. So how to mobilize the funds, how to maintain, how to make sure that the 1.5 degrees emission, sorry, temperature rise target could be still within reach. So you guys try to propose solutions that really tackle the main causes of the problems, which are like deforestation, carbon emissions, and also the lack of funds or the different economic conditions of countries. But something that you could improve further is first regarding the climate financing. You got to make sure that as developed countries, you're actually doing it pragmatically. I mean, maybe we could say that okay, developed countries could finance developing countries. They could help them by giving them funds, but in reality, that would not be very beneficial, right, for the developed countries. Which is great that you guys are actually put like the what was it, like the strategy, the given strategy. Um,
Uh,
what did you mean? What did you name it previously?
Given return strategy.
Return strategy. Yeah, that is also a good thing to point out because, of course, developed countries should not only give to developing countries, but they should also receive something back. So, other than like green investments, you could also propose improvements of your solutions, such as, for example, maybe collaboration in like economic policies. For example, if you make like not only investments but also bilateral agreements, so that if your country reduces emissions, you could be like um, having an increase in export or something, or maybe carbon trading. If any of you are familiar with that, so carbon trading basically means that if one country could reduce more carbon emissions, they will be given like the certificates. So there are a lot of economic or market mechanisms for climate change, and I like that your solutions have actually tried to include some of that. So you could do more research on that and improve your solutions. But so far, for the solutions could already be like included. I think if you would like to write a draft resolution, it could already be included. So thank you so much for the effort. Now we are going to move to the second block, which is the developing countries. So who will be presenting for the developing countries?
Uh, Me.
All right. Yeah. You may
Okay, let me share the screen. Udah kelihatan ya?
Yeah, udah.
Okay, so from our previous discussion, we see from the developing country point of view. So I think it's a bit different, or maybe contrast with developed country. But I think the end goal is the same: to have a sustainable energy in 2050. So first, we think that limiting investment in the coal industry and non-renewable energy sector would uh, be one of the best strategy to end in the usement of dirty energy, like we see it in China and India. Although it is still hard for Indonesia because we still non-renewable oriented based. And for the second point, we think that propose a more green economic oriented national development plan for the future with clear regulation it is basically the same with the first point, but you know, by implementing solar energy based water, wind, nuclear, and biomass um, in the developing country, it would bring like what should I say, ketidakseimbangan ekonomi gitu, because itu baru berpindah gitu kan, and there is geographical uniqueness in each country member, so it's still hard for developing country. For the third point, and I'm sorry, for the third point, cooperating with between developing and developed country, it is basically the same with point number 4, transfer of knowledge, which is basically a capacity building. We could bring that resolution in UN related council, like what we have hasilkan, like Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol. And then we could make an agreement by funding the developing country with an amount of money for the green sector activities, um, by reducing, like cutting down trees for industrial need. And then we could educate people. I think this is severely vital to be bear in mind, because people are, you know, without people people apa namanya, dukungan, astaga, the NGO will be like they they cannot mobilize effectively, because they are non state supported, right? So I think when people have a, a, a proper mindset about this kind of issue, about climate change, I think that um, um, developing country could, you know, like mencapai resolusi yang tepat to um, to end to get zero carbon emission and neutrality that hopefully will be met in 2050. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gerald. So I could see that the developing countries here already try to inject their conditions, their economic backgrounds to the solutions. Jadi mungkin di sini bisa kelihatan mostly you guys are trying to improve the climate action in the domestic side first by cooperating with developed countries to increase your knowledge, your awareness by education, through education, and also transfer of technology and fundings as well. So stance wise, this is already really good. Maybe in an actual MUN, you have to like find the mechanisms, technicalities, but just for the concepts, it's already really good for the solutions. Maybe room for improvements could be seen in the implementation. So previously for developed countries regarding climate financing, so like funding, mobilizing the funds, we need to make sure that developed countries actually get the benefit as well, right, from fundings, climate actions in developing countries. So as developing countries, you have to make sure that this implementation of your solutions are actually conducted effectively. So because this is to make sure that developed countries will keep funding climate actions in your countries. So you have to make sure that the funds that you're receiving will actually be distributed the right way, and will actually be resulting in better environment, in less deforestation, and so on and so forth. So for developing countries, it is really important, I think, to have like monitoring bodies, some kind of that. So like to oversee, to evaluate the implementation of the solutions. So usually in MUNs, monitoring bodies come as solutions in a lot of issues, but especially from developing countries, because maybe it could be seen that developing countries are the ones with the political turbulence. I guess a lot of developing countries have like corrupt governments, so it is really important to have these bodies that will actually make sure that the solutions are implemented. So substance wise, it is already good, but yeah, you could improve that by putting some stuff that could help the implementation. So thank you so much for the presentation for the second block. Props to both blocks. I really like how you guys try to actually use the perspective of different economic backgrounds, developed and developing countries, and translate it into solutions that are relevant um, and also substantially good and correct as well. So after this, we could just move to the Q&A session. Yeah. Okay. So how much time do you have? 30?
It's actually over time, but I think it's for like at max 3 questions. Okay, so anyone would like to raise a question, you can just raise your hand or you can type in the chat box.
Belum ya? Belum ada kan? Or does any of you want to ask? Or maybe you're still thinking of questions to ask?
Okay, then perhaps we'll just do a countdown. Going once, going twice, going thrice. Okay, so perhaps everyone is either tired or scared of asking further questions. But anyway, Uzlah, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't have any more thing to share, but I would just like to highlight the points that I previously have shared. So since climate change or environmental issues in general are actually not that I think significant in MUNs previously. It used to be considered as like low politics. It was not really much discussed about, but now we could see that there's a rising urgency and more in MUNs are talking about climate change, even international level MUNs. So by learning about this, I hope that you guys could actually try to attend actual MUNs with these topics because there are a lot of them, and hopefully through this you could also try to engage more in the issue and maybe do some more research on the topics so that you could improve your knowledge, especially regarding the solutions. Because from what I've seen from your presentations, they're actually already in the level of those students that are attending MUNs about this issue. So yeah, you have a lot of potential to improve that. So yeah, I hope that could mark the end of this.
Okay, thank you so much, Uzlah, for sharing your knowledge and giving us new insights for today's general training. Perhaps before we close the session, I would like for everyone who can to open their cameras on so we can have a screenshot, a quick one, since there are only 24 participants left. Okay, you guys are holding on strong. Cool. Okay, I will take a screenshot. Okay, everyone is opening up their cameras. Anyone else? Okay. Oh, okay. More and more people are opening their cameras up. Anyone else? Okay then. So I will just take the screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Okay, cool. So thank you everyone for coming to today's general training. Also, thank you to Uzla for again giving amazing knowledge on climate change, climate issues, and the role of developing and developed countries in that specific topic. So great job, everyone. Have a nice weekend, and we'll see you at the next general training. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
everyone.
Kai.
Thank you, Kak.
Thank you, Kak.
Thank you so much, Kak.